Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 9 deeply unsettling stories from forest cabins, places where the trees grow thick, the trails go cold, and the nights last longer than they should. These are accounts from people who stepped into the wilderness and came back changed, if they came back at all. Get comfortable, turn the lights down if you're feeling brave, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe. It means more than you know. Story 1. There's a stretch of forest in northern Minnesota that most locals won't name out loud. Not because they're superstitious, or at least that's what they'd tell you, but because giving a place a name makes it real, and some places are safer left vague. My Uncle Darrow had a cabin up there, about 14 miles past the last paved road, sitting at the edge of a black spruce bog that never quite froze even in February. He'd bought it in the late 80s from a man who wouldn't say why he was selling, only that he'd never spent a full night there and didn't plan to start. I heard that story every Thanksgiving. The selling man, the strange price, the key left on the porch instead of handed over. It was one of those family stories that got funnier each year, or at least more exaggerated. Uncle Darrow had spent plenty of full nights there by the time I was old enough to care. He fished the bog in summer, cut wood in fall. Nothing had ever happened to him, that he'd admit to. When Darrow died, this was maybe 6 years ago now, the cabin passed to my mother, who passed it to me, essentially because neither of us wanted it, but someone had to take the deed. I was 31. I'd just gone through a bad breakup and a worse job loss, and I had 3 weeks with nothing to fill them. My therapist, who I was seeing at the time mostly because my mother suggested it, said something about how solitude in nature could be restorative. I'm pretty sure she meant a state park with picnic tables, not 14 miles of unmarked forest road, but I took the advice in my own direction. I brought more food than I needed, 2 paperback novels I never opened, a portable radio that only caught one station, and a fishing rod Darrow had left on the wall. The cabin smelled like pipe tobacco, and something underneath that, damp insulation, maybe, or old wood swelling. There was a wood stove that worked fine, a propane burner for cooking, and a single window in the main room that faced the bog. The glass was old enough that the view through it was slightly warped, like looking at the tree line through water. The first day was fine, good even. I ate canned soup and watched the bog go dark and felt something in my chest loosen that I hadn't known was tight. I slept 8 hours, which I hadn't done in months. The radio played country music I didn't recognize and then static, and I didn't mind either. It was the second afternoon when I found the poles. I'd gone around the south side of the cabin to check on the woodpile, and I noticed, maybe 30 feet into the tree line, 2 long sticks, stripped birch, I think, planted upright in the ground about 4 feet apart. I almost didn't register them as strange. My brain filed them under something Darrow must have put there and moved on. I went back inside, made coffee, stood at the warped window and watched the bog. But they bothered me. Not in a concrete way, just a low-level wrongness I kept bumping into mentally, the way you keep touching a sore tooth with your tongue. When I went back to look, I saw that the sticks weren't just planted, they were connected near the top by a thin cord, and hanging from the cord were small bundles wrapped in what looked like dried grass. There were maybe 6 or 7 of them, evenly spaced, swaying just slightly even though the air was still. I told myself Darrow had put them there years ago, some kind of deer deterrent, maybe, or just an old man's odd project. I almost believed it. I went back inside, stoked the stove, and did not think about them for most of the evening. That night I woke at what felt like 2 or 3 in the morning. Not gradually, just suddenly awake, the way you are when a sound pulls you up. I lay there listening and I heard it, a low knocking, irregular, like something wooden bumping against something hollow. It came from the direction of the bog. I told myself it was a branch, a loon, some kind of waterfowl doing something I didn't understand. I turned over and eventually went back to sleep. In the morning, the bundles were gone. The cord was still there, still strung between the poles, but every single bundle had been removed. The cord was intact, not broken, not cut. They'd just been taken off one by one, and there was nothing on the ground beneath where they'd hung. I probably should have left then. Looking back, I can see that, but I had 2 weeks left and nowhere else to be, and in the daylight it seemed manageable. I told myself an animal, some kind of bird with nest-building instincts. It was not a satisfying explanation, but it was the one I had. The second night was quiet. The third night, around the same dead middle hour, I heard something outside the window. Not the knocking, something else. A slow dragging sound like something heavy being moved across wet leaves. I sat up. The fire had burned low and the cabin was dark except for the orange glow from the stove's grate. I watched the window. Something moved past it. I only saw it for a moment, a shape, low to the ground, moving with a kind of hitching, uneven gait that I can't describe well without sounding like I'm exaggerating. It wasn't walking upright. It wasn't moving on 4 legs the way an animal does either. It was something in between, something that seemed to be figuring out how limbs worked as it went. The window glass was warped, remember, so I was getting a bent, distorted version of what was already dark and unclear. I couldn't make out details. I didn't see a face. I didn't move. I sat on the cot with my knees against my chest, and I watched the window and the shape pass through my field of view, and then it was gone. The dragging sound continued for a few more seconds and then stopped. I did not sleep again that night. In the morning, I walked around the cabin. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I think I just needed to feel like I was doing something. On the north side, in the soft mud near the bog's edge, there were impressions in the ground. Not footprints exactly, more like pressure marks, as if something had knelt or crouched at intervals, moving toward the cabin. They stopped about 4 feet from the wall. Whatever had made them hadn't approached further, or if it had done so without leaving marks. I packed my things and drove out that same morning, left the fishing rod, left the paperbacks, left the radio. I've talked to a property agent twice about selling the place. Both times I got partway through the conversation and then found a reason to postpone. I don't know what I'm waiting for. Maybe I think if I sell it, whatever was out there near the bog gets passed to someone who doesn't know to leave before the third night. The bundles were gone. That's the thing I keep coming back to. The cord was there, the poles were there, but something had visited those bundles before I even arrived, and then came back while I was sleeping and took each one down carefully and moved them somewhere I couldn't find. I still don't know what they were for. I've stopped trying to figure it out. Story 2. I want to be clear that I was not an anxious person before this happened. That's important context. My girlfriend Priya will tell you I was almost aggressively unworried about most things. I once drove a car with a cracked windshield for 6 months and couldn't understand why she found that stressful. I say this because what happened to me changed how I live, and I don't want you to think it was the reaction of someone already primed to be afraid. I was 28. I'd taken a contract job doing trail assessment for a conservation group operating in the Blue Ridge, essentially walking marked trails, noting erosion down trees, potential hazards, and recording GPS data at intervals. Outdoor work, decent pay, no real supervision. I'd do 4 or 5 days alone in a given section, staying at one of the group's maintenance cabins, then move to the next segment. I'd been doing it for about 3 weeks without incident when I got assigned to the Harlan Creek corridor. Nobody mentioned anything unusual about it. My supervisor, a woman named Bet who mostly communicated by email, just sent me the GPS boundaries and the cabin's access code. The access code was 6 digits, and I had to write it on my palm because I kept forgetting it. I drove up on a Monday, or maybe Sunday evening. I'm mixing myself up. I know I stopped for gas at a station that was also a bait shop because I remember the smell, night crawlers and motor oil and somebody's burnt coffee. The woman behind the counter didn't say anything when I paid. Not hello, not have a good one. just took the card and slid the receipt across. I didn't think about that until later. The cabin was maybe a mile from the trailhead, accessible by a dirt road that my truck handled badly. Old structure, Forest Service green, single room with a loft. There was a logbook inside the door, standard practice. Contractors signed in and out and noted any conditions that needed attention. I flipped back through the last few entries out of habit. Most were brief. Notation of a downed oak across trail segment 4, a note about a spring that had shifted course. Then one entry, no date, that just said, stayed one night, heard what I heard, won't be back. No name, no other detail. I laughed at it. Told myself it was someone being dramatic, or maybe it was from years back when the cabin was in worse shape and strange noises were just the structure settling. I signed my own name and the date and went to make dinner. I had 3 days of survey to get through. The first day was straightforward, cool autumn air, good visibility, yellow leaves coming down slowly. I saw deer sign, a few old fire rings off trail that I noted, and one section of trail that had slid badly and needed regrading. I got back to the cabin by late afternoon with good data and tired legs, ate the pasta I'd brought, and was asleep by 9:30. My sleeping bag smelled like the cedar chest I stored it in, which was comforting in the specific way that familiar smells are. I slept well. Second day I went deeper into the corridor, toward the upper watershed where the trail narrowed. It was around midday when I found the tree. A birch, big one, had fallen across the trail maybe a season or two back. There was moss starting on the upper side of the trunk, which told me it wasn't recent. Someone had carved into the fallen trunk. Not initials or a date, not the kind of carving hikers do. A series of marks cut into the bark in careful, even spacing. Vertical strokes, then diagonal, then groups of 3 circles repeating. The pattern ran for about 8 feet along the trunk. The cuts were deep and deliberate, and as far as I could tell, all made at the same time. The wood beneath had aged to the same gray-yellow throughout. I took photos, tagged the GPS location, and noted it in my survey data as a potential historical marker to flag for the Cultural Resources team. That's the part of my brain that was working. The other part, the part I wasn't listening to, registered something else. The spacing of the marks was too regular. Whatever had made them had been patient and consistent in a way that felt less like decoration and more like message. I kept walking. That evening, back at the cabin, I was reviewing my photos from the day when I noticed something in the background of the shot I'd taken of the carved tree. In the woods behind the trunk, maybe 60 feet back in the frame, there was a shape that could have been a person, standing very still between 2 trees. I zoomed in until the image pixelated and lost detail, but I could make out pale, slightly elongated features and arms that hung lower than they should have. I went through the surrounding photos. I'd taken about 30 in that area, and it didn't appear in any of the others, just that one, just standing there. I spent an uncomfortable night talking myself through reasonable explanations. Odd-shaped branch, light and shadow playing tricks with the camera's compression. I was not fully convinced by any of them, but I went to sleep anyway, because what else do you do? On the 3rd morning, I woke up to fog so dense I couldn't see the tree line from the cabin door. I decided to do my last survey section close to the cabin rather than going back up the watershed. I was outside maybe 40 minutes when I heard my own name. Not shouted, spoken, at normal conversation volume from somewhere in the fog to my left. The voice was flat and uninflected, like someone reading my name off a list. But the pronunciation was exactly right, including a stress on the 2nd syllable that most people get wrong. I turned and faced the fog and said nothing. Nothing moved, nothing spoke again. I went back to the cabin and I locked the door, which I hadn't done the previous nights. I sat at the small table with my back to the wall and waited for the fog to lift. It lifted around noon. I didn't go back out. I ate the last of my food, packed my equipment, and drove out that same afternoon, 2 days ahead of schedule. I emailed Bet and said I'd developed a personal situation. She didn't follow up. When I got home and uploaded my survey photos to the shared drive, the one with the shape in the background was corrupted, completely unreadable. Every other photo from the trip transferred cleanly. Just that one came through as noise. I'm not claiming I know what was in those woods. I don't. What I know is that it knew my name, and it said it the way someone would say it if they'd been listening to other people use it for a long time. Story 3. Growing up in the Ozarks, you get used to people saying the land has memory. My grandmother Eula, she was part of the generation that didn't distinguish much between folk saying and truth. She used to say there were places in these hills where the ground remembered things that had happened on it and held onto that memory the way a sponge holds water. Press on it and it would seep back out. I thought that was beautiful when I was a kid. Now I think she was giving a polite name to something less poetic. I was 34 when my friend Tomas and I drove out to spend a long weekend at a rented cabin near the Mark Twain National Forest. Tomas had found it online, one of those rental listings that describes itself as rustic and off-grid and means it. We were both going through the kind of mild life fatigue that happens in your mid-30s when nothing is dramatically wrong, but everything feels slightly too heavy. We wanted to sit on a porch and drink bad beer and not look at our phones. The listing had 5 stars and the photos showed a decent porch. What the listing didn't mention was the pit. It was maybe 200 yards from the cabin, tucked into a low area between 2 ridges where the ground stayed damp year-round. Not a natural depression, the edges were too uniform, the sides too vertical. It was roughly circular, maybe 12 feet across, and as far as I could tell when Tomas dropped a stick in, about 15 feet deep. The walls were shale and dark soil. The bottom was shadowed enough that we couldn't see it from the rim. "Old well," Tomas said. That was my first thought too, but there was no casing, no framework, no remnant of any structure around it. It was just a hole, a very deliberate, very precise hole in the ground that had been there long enough for the vegetation around it to re-establish itself normally, as if it had always been there. We went back to the cabin and didn't really talk about it. We made dinner. I had brought sausages. Tomas had brought an impressive quantity of hot sauce and exactly one vegetable, which was a bell pepper he didn't end up using. We sat on the porch in the early dark and listened to the woods settle. It was nice. I felt the week's tension dropping out of my shoulders. Tomas started a story about a coworker of his, and I followed it for a while before noticing I'd zoned out. The cabin's porch faced east, away from the pit's direction. I want to note that because I kept finding myself turning to look over my shoulder to the west even while Tomas was talking, not consciously, just a pull. We went to bed reasonable early for us, maybe 11. I don't know when I woke up. There was no clock in the cabin and I'd left my phone face down, but it was deep night, no light at the windows. What woke me was a smell, damp earth and something older underneath it, like a smell that had been underground for a long time and was only now reaching the surface. I lay there for a minute. Then I heard the sound that I still can't fully explain, a rhythmic, low, hollow percussion coming from outside, like something striking the inside of a drum if the drum was the size of a large room. Steady, patient, coming from the direction of the pit. I got up. I want to be honest that I don't know why. It was not a brave decision. It was more like my legs made it before my brain consulted. I put on my boots and went outside. The night was clear, the moon bright enough to see by. I walked toward the sound and stopped at the edge of the tree line, maybe 40 feet from the pit's rim. The sound was louder outside, and now that I was closer, I could hear something else underneath it, a voice. Low, rhythmic, not quite a language, or at least not a language I recognized, rising and falling with the percussion. I stood there longer than was wise. The voice and the sound continued at the same pace, unaware of me, or so I thought, until it stopped. Both sounds stopped simultaneously, mid-beat, mid-syllable, total silence. Then from the pit, very clearly, a single knock, as if in response to me. I ran back to the cabin, inside, door locked, the useless lock of a rental property. Tomas was awake when I came in. I must have made noise, and I told him what I'd heard, and he did what a good friend does, which is take me seriously without necessarily believing me. We sat at the kitchen table until morning. He made coffee twice. The percolator was one of those old-fashioned ones that takes forever and makes a lot of noise, and I was grateful for every sound it made. In the morning, we walked back to the pit together. In the daylight, it looked like it always had just a hole. But at the rim, in the damp ground, there were marks arranged in a precise semicircle facing east, facing the cabin, not footprints. Circular impressions, evenly spaced, pressed deep into the earth as if made by something standing on the ends of narrow cylindrical posts. There were 9 of them. 8 pressed into the mud and 1 slightly off-center, half-pressed, as if whatever had made them had stopped mid-step. We checked out 4 hours later, forfeiting 2 nights of the rental. Tomas filed a confused review online that mentioned unexpected disturbances without detail. I thought about writing something more specific, and then thought about who would believe it and didn't. My grandmother Eula died the summer before this trip. I keep thinking about what she said, the land holds memory like a sponge. I keep thinking about what's pressing on that ground near the pit, what it's pushing back out. Story 4. My sister Adiz thinks I have an overactive imagination. She said that before I went to the cabin, and she's said it more since, which tells you something about how useful she found my account. I've stopped trying to convince her. I'm writing this down, or whatever this is, talking it through, because it happened and I was there, and I have the fingernails to prove it. The cabin belonged to a colleague of mine named Whitfield, who offered it to me for a week in October, the way people offer things they don't use but feel guilty letting go to waste. He'd inherited it from a great aunt who had no other heirs, used it twice, and found that he preferred hotels. It was in the Cascade foothills in Washington, which I'd never visited, about 3 miles off a main trail network. He gave me a hand-drawn map and a key and said the fireplace could be temperamental. I drove up on a Thursday. The map was more impressionistic than accurate, which meant I took 2 wrong turns on forest roads that looked identical and lost about 40 minutes. But I found it eventually, a low, dark-shingled structure almost invisible against the fir trees behind it, with a covered porch and a woodpile that had been there long enough for mushrooms to establish on the lower logs. There was a single wind chime by the door made from what looked like fishing lures. They clinked softly as I went in, even though the air was still. Inside, a rag rug I somehow tracked mud onto immediately, a wood stove that was not temperamental but merely ancient, a bookshelf with 8 paperbacks all missing their covers, and a framed photo on the wall above the kitchen table. The photo showed 2 people standing in front of the cabin. A woman I'd guess was in her 60s, and a man somewhat younger. They were not looking at the camera. They were looking at something to the left of the frame, out of view. Both of their expressions were wrong in a way I couldn't name immediately. Not afraid, exactly, more like absorbed, like they'd forgotten the camera was there. I made a note to ask Whitfield about the photo and then forgot to for the next 3 years. The first 2 days were what they were supposed to be. I hiked the main trail in the morning and came back to the cabin in the afternoon with good, tired legs and ate too much pasta, which is apparently a theme in my life. The woods there are dense and dark-floored, that Pacific Northwest green that looks saturated even in gray weather. I saw a black bear at maybe 40 yards on the second morning, a young one who regarded me briefly and then went back to its business with the kind of supreme indifference that I found comforting. The third night I left the porch door open because the cabin held heat and I'd been sleeping poorly. I woke up in the dark with the absolute certain sensation that something was in the room with me. Not a sound, not a movement, just the knowing, the way you sometimes know someone's awake in the dark beside you even when they're not making a sound. I opened my eyes and lay still. In the doorway from the main room to the porch, there was a figure. Not in the room, not fully outside, standing in the threshold, occupying the door frame in a way that seemed to fill it entirely despite the figure not being particularly large. It was facing me. I could see the shape of a head and shoulders against the slightly lighter dark of the porch, and I could see that its proportions were not quite right. The head too large, the shoulders too narrow, the arms folded or held in some arrangement I couldn't parse. I could not make myself move. Every part of my body said still, still, stay still, and I have thought about that a lot since, whether it was my fear response or whether I was somehow stopped from outside myself, and I genuinely don't know. It stood there for what felt like a full minute. Then it moved or it stopped being there. I couldn't tell you which because I'd blinked and it wasn't in the doorway anymore. What I can tell you is what I found when I turned on the lamp. The rag rug in the doorway had been dragged about 18 inches into the room, bunched and wrinkled as if something had stepped into it, into the rug center, and then backed out, pulling the rug behind it before releasing. I checked the porch. Empty. I checked the woodpile area. Empty. I sat in the kitchen with the lights on until the sun came through the trees, which took hours. The framed photo above the table, in the morning light I looked at it again. The two people looking at something out of frame. I turned it around on the nail and looked at the back. On the cardboard backing, in faded pencil, someone had written a single word that I'd rather not repeat here because it felt private in a way I can't explain, like reading someone's medical chart. A word I didn't know. I haven't been able to find it in any language I've searched, and I've searched. I didn't tell Whitfield any of this when I returned the key. He asked how the cabin was, and I said fine, and he seemed relieved and offered it again the following year. I said I'd think about it. I haven't thought about it. Not because I've put it behind me, but because the word on the back of the photo keeps interrupting me every time I try. Story 5. There were 4 of us when we went in. There were 4 of us when we came out. That's what I tell people when they ask, because it matters to them, the number. It's the part that closes the story. What I don't say is that for about 3 hours in the middle, I was not 100% certain which version of each of us was the real one. This was the Shawnee National Forest, southern Illinois, the Garden of the Gods area, though we were well off any marked path by the time things went wrong. I was 26. The group was me, my roommate Calder, a woman named Bess who Calder had dated the previous year, but who had somehow remained in our friend group without drama, and Bess's younger brother Felix, who was 19 and very excited about everything in a way I found exhausting until I found it endearing, which took about 4 hours of shared car space. We were doing a 4-day backpacking trip with rough camping, no established sites, just picking spots and setting up. First day was beautiful. The geology down there is unusual, big outcrops and bluffs and these impossible balanced rocks, and Felix photographed everything with an actual film camera he'd found at an estate sale and kept asking if we thought the exposure was right. Bess told him to put the camera down and look. He did not put the camera down. The second day, Calder said something strange. We stopped for lunch at a creek crossing, and he said, almost casually, that he'd had a weird dream the night before, that he'd woken up and gone outside and walked partway back toward the trailhead. Not for any reason, just walked, and then come back. He said it felt real, but he'd been in his sleeping bag when he woke up, so it must have been a dream. We moved on. I did not think about it again until the second night, when I woke up at what must have been 2 in the morning, and Calder's sleeping bag was empty. I went outside and found him standing at the edge of the camp, about 20 feet out, facing away from me, facing the trees. I said his name. He turned around and walked back, said he'd needed air, and went back to his bag. His movements were fine. His voice was normal. He went to sleep immediately, and I lay awake watching the tent wall. On day 3, Felix took a photo. He didn't mean to, not of what it captured. We'd been walking a ridgeline and he'd turned to take a photo of Bess from behind, one of those candid hiking shots. When we got back and he developed the roll, that photo had something in it. Bess in the foreground, her red jacket, the trail, the trees, and between 2 trees about 30 feet off the trail, a shape that was configured like a person, except the perspective was wrong. It was facing the camera. It was facing Felix. But what was wrong, what Felix pointed out when he showed me the print, holding it under a lamp and saying, "Does this look right to you?" was that its shadow fell opposite to every other shadow in the photograph. Every other shadow ran left. Its shadow ran right, as if it were standing in different light entirely. I can tell you what we saw the 3rd night, though I want to be careful here because my memory of it is fragmented in a way that doesn't feel like normal forgetting. We made camp in a hollow, sheltered on 3 sides by rock. Bess woke me up and she was already awake, which meant she'd woken up before me and hadn't woken me immediately, which tells you something about how she was processing it. She pointed at the tree line. There were 2 of them, standing about 30 feet apart at the edge of the hollow. They were built like people, moved like people when they moved at all, but they were facing us in a way that had no self-consciousness, no recognition that we might object to being watched. The way an animal watches, not a person. One of them turned its head and looked at the other, and the head movement was so fluid, so frictionless, that it didn't seem to involve a neck at all. We did not wake the others. I don't know why. We just sat there in the cold and watched them, and they watched us, and eventually, they were gone. Bess and I agreed we'd seen them. We agreed we wouldn't talk about them in front of Calder and Felix, and we never did, and to this day I don't know if that was a good decision. We hiked out the next morning, 4 of us, faster than was comfortable. Felix kept looking back. When I asked him what he was looking for, he said nothing, and changed the subject. I didn't push it. The shadow in the photo runs the wrong direction. Felix still has the print. I asked him once if I could scan it, and he said he'd rather not. I think he's right. Story 6. I don't want to tell you where exactly because I'm still not sure I'm done with the place. That probably sounds cryptic, but I mean it practically. There are still decisions I haven't made about what to do with the property, and I don't want anything I say here to complicate that. So let me say it was the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and leave the county out. The cabin was my grandfather Ursula's. He built it himself in the 1960s, which you could tell from every structural decision he'd made. It was overbuilt in some places and confusingly minimal in others, all according to a logic that died with him. He'd used it for hunting every November until he couldn't anymore, and then it sat empty for the better part of a decade before I inherited it at 29 along with a box of his papers and a collection of hand-tied fishing flies that were too beautiful to ever use. I went up in late August alone, partly to assess what repairs it needed and partly, I'll be honest, because my life in the city had gotten very loud in that specific quiet way where nothing is wrong but everything is too much. I wanted the silence. I wanted to wake up to something that wasn't construction noise and other people's anxiety. The drive up was long, and the last part of it was on a 2-track through dense forest where the trees were close enough to scratch both sides of my car simultaneously. I noted the scratch marks when I got out and added them to the growing list of things I'd need to deal with. The cabin smelled exactly like I remembered from childhood, pine resin and my grandfather's pipe tobacco, which had apparently seeped into the wood permanently, even though he'd been dead for 12 years. I stood in the doorway for a minute just breathing it. I spent the first day cleaning and taking notes. There was a spot in the north-facing wall where moisture had worked its way in and the insulation had gone soft. The porch boards needed replacing. The hand pump at the well still worked, which was surprising and very welcome. My grandfather had left a journal on the shelf, which I opened expecting hunting records, and found mostly just weather observations and notes about what he'd seen, bird species, animal tracks, the state of the sky on a given evening. He wrote about the forest the way some people write about a person they lived with a long time. In the last dozen pages, though, something changed. The entries got shorter and the handwriting got different, not shaky exactly, but compressed, like he was writing under some pressure of time or attention. The observations were still there, but interspersed with other things. Something in the tree line at dusk, same position as 2 nights prior. Did not go to the south trail today. Heard it again, or heard what it wanted me to hear. I read that one 3 times, what it wanted me to hear. The last entry was a date, October 3rd, no year, and the single sentence: it knows the edge of the property. It will not cross, but it knows. I set the journal down and looked out the window at the tree line. The afternoon light was going orange and the forest wall looked like it always did, just trees, just shadow between them. The journal had to be old, I told myself. He'd been fine for years after he stopped going up there. There was no follow-up horror story. My grandfather had died in a hospital bed at 78 of ordinary causes. Whatever he'd written about, he'd left it here and lived a full life afterward. I went to make dinner and told myself I felt fine. I did feel fine, until the middle of the second night. I was awake for no reason I could identify. The cabin was quiet. I lay in my grandfather's old cot, the same one with the same wool blanket which still smelled like him, and I listened to the nothing, and then I realized the nothing was not right. I mean, there was no insect sound. The UP in August is loud with insects, cicadas, and crickets, a constant ambient wall of sound, and it had simply stopped. The silence was not peaceful, it was deliberate. Through the window at the south end of the cabin, the window that faced the tree line, not the clearing, I saw it, a face pressed against the outside of the glass. Not a whole figure, just a face from just above the nose down to the chin. The lower half of a face, pale and featureless in the moonlight, with a mouth that was slightly open and pressed flat against the glass so that the lips were spread sideways, thin. It stayed there for 10 seconds, maybe 15, completely still. Then it was gone. And the insect sound came back all at once, like a door opening. I did not sleep. In the morning I went to the window and found the glass fogged from outside, the condensation still there though the air was warm. In the fogged glass, finger drawn from outside, a single line, vertical, just a vertical line about 6 inches long, nothing else. Whether it was a mark or a letter or a number or just the result of something pressing and dragging, I genuinely cannot say. The journal was my grandfather's. The cabin was his. He wrote it knows the edge of the property, and I think what he meant was that the boundary was a negotiation, not a wall. I still haven't decided about the cabin. The repairs are extensive and the drive is long, and the property would be difficult to sell without disclosure. But sometimes in the city, I think about the insect sound coming back like a door opening. And I think that maybe that door can open from both sides. Story 7. I moved to British Columbia when I was 23 for reasons that felt enormous at the time and seem smaller now. My ex-partner had a contract there and I followed them, which I don't regret exactly, but when the relationship ended, I found myself 7 years later in a city I'd never chosen with a life I'd assembled slowly from available parts. The cabin trip started as something to do alone. A way of learning the landscape I'd been living inside, but not really seeing. The cabin I'm going to tell you about wasn't mine. It belonged to a woman named Ségolène, who I knew through a hiking club, who let members use it on a sign-up basis in exchange for doing maintenance work. You signed up for a slot, drove up, noted any repairs needed, did whatever was within your ability, and had the place to yourself for 2 or 3 days. I'd done it twice before. It was a good system. This trip was October, which in the interior of BC means the birches have gone gold and the temperature drops hard at night and the light goes the way that always makes me feel like time is moving differently. I drove up a Friday. The access road had been recently graveled, which was new, and there was a new padlock on the shed. Ségolène must have had the place broken into. A note on the kitchen table said the pump had been serviced and the chimney cleaned, and there was a new pack of coffee filters on the counter, which I found unexpectedly touching. I settled in, made coffee, went for a short walk before the light failed just to check the trail conditions as I was supposed to. The main trail looped north from the cabin for about 4 miles and came back through a stand of old-growth Douglas fir that was the best part of the whole area. Enormous trees, muffled light, the ground carpeted in needle fall. I'd been looking forward to it all week. I noticed the first thing about a mile out. A tree off the trail, a birch, had been partially stripped of bark, not by a deer. The height was wrong and the stripped section was pale and raw-looking, and carved into it in deep, careful strokes was a shape I want to describe accurately. An oval with a vertical line through it, and below that, 2 parallel horizontal lines, and below that, a circle. The marks were not fresh, they'd started to gray at the edges, but the carving was deep enough that I couldn't tell when exactly. I photographed it and moved on. I found 3 more on the walk back, same shape on different trees, the same orientation, all on the east-facing side, spaced, I estimated, maybe 300 meters apart. Whatever they marked consistently. I slept well that night, which in hindsight is something I wonder about. Usually, I don't sleep well in unfamiliar places alone. But I went down fast and stayed down, and I woke up feeling like I'd been asleep for 12 hours even though it had been 7. In the afternoon of the second day, I went deep into the old-growth section. This part of the forest is something else. The scale of those trees does something to your sense of self. You become very small very fast. The light filters down in columns, and the sound is muffled, and walking through it always gives me the sense of walking into something that doesn't know I'm there yet. I was sitting on a root, eating a granola bar when I heard breathing. Not an animal, too slow, too deliberate. Human breathing, measured and even, coming from behind a tree about 15 feet to my right. I sat still. I told myself it was a hiker. The main trail was close enough that hikers weren't impossible, and people stopped and rested, and this was fine. I ate the rest of the granola bar. I waited. The breathing did not change pace, did not come closer, did not move away. I said, loudly enough to hear, "Is someone there?" The breathing stopped. Not like someone holding their breath. It stopped cleanly mid-exhale, as if a recording had been cut. I stood up and walked toward the tree and looked around its base, and there was nothing. The needle carpet was thick enough that I couldn't read prints clearly, but the ground was undisturbed in the way that it is when nothing has stood there recently. No compression, no shifted debris. Nothing had been breathing behind that tree. Nothing that left any mark had been breathing behind that tree. I walked back to the cabin faster than I'd walked out. That night I heard it on the roof. Wait, slow moving, crossing from the north end of the cabin to the south. Not running, not dropping, walking, if walking is what it was, each placement careful and deliberate. I could feel the slight flex of the rafters through the walls. It crossed twice, north to south and back, and then stopped above the main room and did not move again. I sat in my sleeping bag with the lamp on and waited. After an hour, the weight shifted, moved to the edge of the roof above the window and stopped. I did not go to the window. I want to be honest that this was not bravery. It was pure inability to make my body do that particular thing. In the morning, I went outside and looked at the roof. The green metal roofing that covered the main room had marks on it, 3 parallel grooves, not deep, running the length of the roof section as if something had dragged across it. They were consistent in pressure and spacing, too consistent to be branch damage, too parallel to be random. I did the maintenance notes Ségolène needed, turned off the water and drove out. I noted the roof marks in the log I left her, said possibly an animal maintenance check recommended. She emailed me a week later to say the roofing contractor she'd sent up had found nothing wrong and thought the marks might be from falling branches. I wrote back that made sense and said nothing else. I haven't signed up for another slot. The website still has the cabin listed. The October slots are always available. I've noticed that. Story 8. When my father died, he left me 2 things worth mentioning. A watch that keeps losing 6 minutes a week no matter what I do, and a parcel of land in northern Georgia with a 1-room cabin on it that he'd been paying taxes on for 30 years without, as far as I can tell, ever setting foot on it. I was 37. My name is Renata, and I'm telling you that only because I want you to understand that I'm not someone who has panic attacks or sees things. I'm a structural engineer. I spend my professional life dealing with what is provable and load-bearing. When I drove up to that cabin in the Chattahoochee National Forest on a weekend in November, I was thinking about the foundation inspection, the roof condition, and whether the place was worth selling or worth burning. Not haunting, not stories. I was thinking practically. The land had a long driveway, nearly a 1/4 mile, grown over on both sides by aggressive brush. My car pushed through it, and I felt the vegetation scraping the undercarriage, and I thought about scratch marks again, which made me think about Darrow's cabin in Minnesota without knowing why. Oh wait, that's someone else's story, not mine. What I mean is, the scraping felt like resistance, like going somewhere that didn't open for visitors. The cabin was smaller than the county records suggested and in better condition than I'd expected. Log construction, dovetail corners, concrete piers that someone had re-leveled at some point, not my father since he'd never been there. Someone else before him, keeping the place up out of some principle I'd never know. The inside had been cleared out but not stripped. There was a table bolted to one wall, a hand-forged hook by the door, and a cast-iron stove in the corner that was worth more than the rest of the place combined. I set up my equipment, moisture meter, camera, inspection forms, and spent the first afternoon doing a proper assessment. The north wall had some checking in the logs, nothing structural. The roof needed a ridge cap. The piers were sound. I made notes and photographed everything and felt competent and settled. The first evening I sat outside in the truck because the cabin had no furniture and I'd only brought a sleeping bag I hadn't set up yet. I ate a sandwich and listened to the trees. There was a radio station that faded in and out, mostly classical, which suited the mood. I finished the sandwich and thought about calling my sister, but the signal was too poor, and I thought about my father and what he'd done with 30 years of owning land he never visited, and whether that was negligence or intention. I slept in the sleeping bag on the floor and woke once at what I estimated was 4 a.m. to the sound of something outside that I placed immediately and correctly as a bobcat call and went back to sleep without drama. On the second day, I walked the property boundaries. This is part of what you do with land you've inherited. You walk it, you get a physical sense of what you own. The parcel was 19 acres, mostly wooded, running up a gentle ridge to the north. Near the ridge's crest, where the trees thinned slightly, I found the stones. They were arranged in a pattern on the ground, roughly circular, maybe 20 feet in diameter. Not large stones, each one about the size of 2 fists, flat-bottomed. They'd been placed deliberately. The arrangement was too regular to be natural, and they were all the same type of stone, brought from somewhere else because the local rock looked nothing like them. In the center of the arrangement, there was an empty space about 4 feet across. And in that space the soil was dark and compacted in a way that suggested it had been used. Repeatedly, recently enough that it hadn't grown over. I am an engineer. I assessed this as an artifact of unknown cultural origin, photographed it from multiple angles, and noted that the access to this area was theoretically possible from 3 different directions, including 2 that crossed adjacent property. I did not touch the stones. I do not know why I did not touch the stones. I did not make the decision consciously. That night, the second night, the last one I'd planned, something woke me just past midnight. A sound from outside that I had no category for. Not animal, not wind, not structure settling. A low resonant sound, more felt than heard, like the frequency below where ears work clearly but where the chest still registers something. It went on for about 30 seconds and then stopped. I sat up and listened. It happened again and again, evenly spaced like respiration but much slower. I turned on my flashlight and shone it at the window. The glass reflected it back. I couldn't see out. I moved to the door. I want to be clear that what happened next was not a deliberate choice. My hand went to the door handle and stopped, and I stood there in the dark with my hand on the handle and could not make myself open it. The sound continued for 3 more cycles and then stopped. When I opened the door in the morning, there was a stone on the step. The same type as the stones on the ridge, flat-bottomed, palm-sized, pale gray. Placed precisely in the center of the step, not thrown, not dropped, placed with deliberate positioning. I did not go back to the stone circle. I drove out, and on the 2-hour drive home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, not because I saw anything, but because I could not make myself stop. I've since had the land surveyed with the intention of selling. The surveyor flagged the stone arrangement as a possible historical site requiring review before any development. That review has been pending for 18 months. The stone from the step is in a box in my garage. I haven't thrown it out and I haven't moved it inside. It stays in the box and the box stays in the garage, and I'm aware that this is not a resolution. Story 9. The last summer I spent entirely in Vermont. I was 22 and broke in the comfortable way you can be at 22 when you have no obligations and a tent. I'd been couchsurfing through a loosely planned road trip that had stalled out when my car needed a repair I couldn't afford. And I was waiting in a small town south of the Northeast Kingdom for the money to come through. Staying on the property of a man named Bertrand who ran a small CSA farm and rented tent sites to hikers and seasonal workers. He charged almost nothing and asked almost nothing in return, except that you not bother the chickens. Bertrand had a neighbor. His property bordered a stretch of state forest, and within that forest, maybe 1.5 miles up an old logging road, sat an abandoned cabin that had belonged to the neighbor before the neighbor moved away without explanation around 15 years prior. Bertrand mentioned this the way he mentioned most things, in a flat tone that communicated information without opinion. He told me the logging road was usable on foot and that the cabin was standing more or less, and that the forest up that way was nice, but that he personally hadn't gone past the 1/4-mile mark since 2009. He didn't elaborate on why. I was 22 and waiting for money, and I had nothing but time. I went on a Tuesday, or maybe Wednesday. I wasn't tracking days carefully that summer. It was overcast but warm, the kind of Vermont summer morning that promises afternoon rain but can't quite commit. The logging road was exactly what Bertrand described, wide enough to walk comfortably, soft with old needle fall, lined by mixed forest that got denser as I went up. I was eating the last of some trail mix I'd found in the bottom of my pack, and thinking about nothing in particular when I crossed what I later decided was the 1/4-mile mark. The temperature changed. Not dramatically, it was still warm, still August. But there was something in the air that hadn't been there before, a quality that I want to call attention without knowing if that's the right word. Like something noticing you, not necessarily with threat, not yet, just with awareness. I kept walking. The cabin appeared around a bend in the road. Well, appeared is generous. It revealed itself gradually. First the corner of a roof visible through thinning trees, then a wall, then the full structure, which was smaller than I'd imagined and more intact than I'd expected. Board and batten construction, most of the boards still in place, a covered entry that had partly collapsed but hadn't taken the door down with it. The windows were intact, which surprised me most. 15 years of empty and the glass still there. I stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at it for a minute before I went any further. I'm not sure why. It wasn't that anything was actively wrong, more that the clearing around the cabin felt like a held breath, like the pause between heartbeats. I was not scared at this point. I was something less definable than scared and more uncomfortable. I went inside anyway because I was 22 and possessed of the specific idiotic confidence of being 22. The inside was stripped but not completely. Someone had taken the furniture and the personal belongings, the things that were worth taking. What remained was infrastructure. A wood stove, a metal utility shelf still bolted to the wall, a window latch on the inside of each window. On the floor near the stove, a small pile of ash that was old enough to have compressed into a gray wafer. On the shelf, 3 glass canning jars, empty, lids off, lined up with the care of someone who'd meant to fill them. I spent about 20 minutes inside, looking around, feeling simultaneously like I was trespassing and like the cabin had been waiting for someone to come and simply witness it. There was something almost domestic about the 3 empty jars, like a dinner set for people who weren't coming. I went back outside and sat on the edge of the clearing and ate the last of my trail mix and thought about the person who had lived here, who had driven away or walked away, and why. The afternoon clouds were building. I should have started back. Instead, I sat there and the forest was very quiet, and then it became quieter than it had been. The birds stopped, the wind stopped. And in that specific quality of silence, I heard something begin, a sound low and musical, coming from the direction of the tree line to my left. It took me a moment to identify it because the context was so wrong. It was singing. Someone was singing. A single voice, low, tuneless in the way very old songs can be tuneless, not without melody, but without a melody that resolves, that goes anywhere you expect. It was coming from the trees, maybe 30 feet in, moving slowly parallel to the clearing's edge. I stood up. I should have been looking at the tree line. Instead, I was looking down at my feet because some part of me did not want to see what was moving through the trees while singing in a voice that pitched and curved like weather. I heard it continue for 30 seconds, maybe 45, moving from my left toward the far end of the clearing. And then it rounded something and the sound changed direction slightly, and I understood it was circling the clearing. Not approaching, just circling. It came around to my right side and I finally looked. Between 2 trees at the far edge of the clearing, partially in shadow, was a figure that was shaped like a person but whose movements as it walked had a quality I can only describe as secondary, like watching a video of walking rather than actual walking, like each step was remembered rather than performed. Its hair was long and caught the gray light. It was not looking at me. It was looking at the cabin. The singing continued and I noticed then what the voice was doing. It was not random melody. It was counting, not in numbers I recognized, not in English, but the rhythm was counting rhythm, the same short phrase repeated, like a child counting to play a game. One phrase over and over with the same 2-note fall at the end of each iteration. It counted 7 times and then it stopped walking and it stopped singing and it turned its face in the direction I was standing, not toward me exactly, slightly past me, like it was looking at the cabin through me. I ran. Not strategically, not having made a decision. I was just suddenly running back down the logging road and the road went and went and the trees were close on both sides and I didn't look back. I got back to Bertrand's farm and I sat by his chicken coop. And his chickens made their chicken noises, and I sat there in that completely ordinary sound for a very long time. I got my car fixed 2 days later and left Vermont. I never told Bertrand what I'd seen, partly because I didn't think he'd be surprised, and partly because telling him would have required saying out loud the part I still find hardest to explain. That when the figure turned its face in my direction, I understood, not through any logic, just understood in my body, that the counting was not aimless. That 7 was not an arbitrary stopping point. That it was counting the times I'd breathed since I'd come into the clearing. I've tried to remember if I felt counted before the singing started. I think I did. I think the knowing in the air when I crossed Bertrand's quarter-mile mark, the quality I called attention, was not the beginning of the counting. It was the acknowledgement that the counting had already been going on and that the number was getting interesting. I don't go into unfamiliar forest alone anymore. I go in groups on marked trails, and I come out before the light changes. If I ever find myself in a clearing that holds its breath, I don't wait to find out why. Thanks for staying with these stories all the way to the end. If something in here kept you awake a little longer than you planned, drop a comment. I'd genuinely love to know which one got to you. Hit the like button if this is the kind of darkness you want more of, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Some of you have been here since the beginning, and it means everything. Stay close to the light out there, and if you can't, stay close to whatever keeps you moving.